In the summer of 1944, 3 months after D-Day, the 5th Armored Division was losing tanks faster than the Germans could destroy them. The enemy wasn't winning through superior firepower. They were winning because American steel was killing American crews. 12 Sherman tanks had suffered catastrophic transmission failures in a single week near the hedgerows of Normandy. The gearboxes seized mid-advance, leaving the crews exposed, immobile, vulnerable. 3 tanks were abandoned under fire. 7 men died trying to escape machines that had betrayed them before the enemy ever fired a shot. The technical reports were clear. The M4 Sherman's synchromesh transmission was failing under sustained combat load. The gears were grinding themselves into dust. Maintenance crews worked around the clock, replacing entire assemblies, but the failures continued. Engineers from Detroit were flown in. They examined the wreckage, measured tolerances, checked metallurgy. Their conclusion was delivered with cold precision. The transmissions were operating within acceptable parameters. The failures, they said, were statistical anomalies. Bad luck, the price of war. But Lieutenant Colonel Raymond Moss didn't believe in bad luck. He had commanded armor since North Africa, and he knew the sound of a transmission about to fail. It wasn't loud, it was a whisper, a faint grinding that most crews ignored until it was too late. He had heard it in his own tank 3 days before it seized completely, leaving him stranded 200 yards from the German line. He survived because his crew abandoned the vehicle in under 40 seconds. Others weren't as fast. Moss gathered his battalion mechanics in a burned-out barn outside St. Lo. 23 men, most of them farm boys from Iowa, Nebraska, Missouri, places where you fix things because the nearest repair shop was 50 miles away and you didn't have 50 miles. He told them the truth. Detroit didn't understand what was happening, and command didn't care enough to stop operations while they figured it out. The battalion would continue its advance toward Paris. More transmissions would fail. More crews would die. "We fix it ourselves," Moss said, "or we bury more men." The mechanics nodded. They had already been trying. Standard maintenance wasn't working. Replacing parts wasn't working. The problem was somewhere deeper. Somewhere the engineers in their clean laboratories couldn't see because they had never driven a 30-ton steel box through mud, over rubble, up hills, down craters, hour after hour, day after day, until the metal itself began to scream. Among the mechanics was Private Eugene Harding, 19 years old, from a dairy farm in Wisconsin. He had been trained as a welder at Fort Knox, but his real education had come from 12 years of keeping his father's tractors running through Wisconsin winters. Harding had been quiet during the meeting, but as the others filed out, he stayed behind. "Sir," he said, "I think I know what's breaking." Moss turned. "Tell me." Harding pulled a wrench from his belt and crouched beside the nearest Sherman. He pointed to the transmission housing, a massive iron casing bolted to the hull floor. "It's not the gears, sir. It's the mount." Moss frowned. "The mount's solid steel. It's not moving." "It's moving," Harding said, "just not enough to see, but enough to throw the alignment off by a fraction. Every time we hit a crater or climb a slope, the whole transmission flexes. The gears bind, then they grind, then they fail." Moss stared at him. "The engineers checked the mounts." "They checked them standing still, sir. Not under combat load." There was a long silence. The barn smelled of diesel and scorched metal. Outside, the distant rumble of artillery rolled across the fields like thunder that never stopped. "Can you fix it?" Moss asked. Harding hesitated. "I can try." "How?" "Reinforce the mount. Add a secondary support bracket, something that distributes the load better." Moss's jaw tightened. "That's modification of military equipment without authorization. If it fails, it's sabotage. If it works, it's insubordination." Harding met his eyes. "If we do nothing, sir, more crews die." Moss was quiet for a long time. Then he nodded once. "Do it. But if anyone asks, you're performing routine maintenance. Understood?" "Yes, sir." That night, Eugene Harding worked alone in the dark. Using scrap steel from a destroyed German half-track and a welding torch he had repaired himself. He didn't have blueprints. He didn't have approval. He had a hunch, a farm boy's instinct for what happens to metal under stress, and the memory of every tractor he had ever saved from the scrapyard. By dawn, he had welded a triangular support brace beneath the transmission mount of Lieutenant Moss's command tank. It was crude, ugly, and completely unauthorized. 3 days later, that tank would lead the battalion through the heaviest fighting of the month, and it would be the only Sherman in the division that didn't fail. Lieutenant Colonel Moss didn't tell anyone about the modification. He simply ordered his tank back into rotation and waited. The battalion was scheduled to push east toward Mortain, where German forces were massing for a counter-offensive. Intelligence estimated 3 panzer divisions. The terrain was brutal, narrow roads, steep hills, dense bocage that turned every field into a killing box. It was exactly the kind of combat that destroyed transmissions. Moss's tank took point. For 6 hours it climbed, descended, turned, reversed, absorbed recoil from its own gun, and absorbed impact from near-miss shells. The crew waited for the grinding sound, the sudden loss of power, the sickening moment when the gears locked and the machine became a coffin. It never came. The transmission held. The tank moved like it had been built for this, like the steel had finally remembered what it was supposed to do. When the battalion pulled back that evening, Moss ordered his driver to shut down the engine and remain inside. He walked a slow circle around the tank, looking for stress cracks, listening for the ticking sound of overheated metal. Nothing. He crouched beneath the hull and examined Harding's weld. It was still solid. No fractures, no separation. The brace had absorbed the shock that would have destroyed the transmission mount. Moss found Harding in the motor pool, cleaning a carburetor. "It worked," he said quietly. Harding looked up, grease-streaked and exhausted. The brace, 6 hours of combat. No failure." Harding nodded slowly, like he had expected this but was afraid to believe it. "We should install it on the others, sir." Moss hesitated. The regulation was clear. Unauthorized modifications were court-martial offenses. But so was negligence. So was sending men into combat in machines you knew would fail. "How many can you do in 48 hours?" Moss asked. "If I get help, 12 tanks." "Do it. I'll handle the paperwork." There was no paperwork. There was only the unspoken agreement between a commander and a mechanic that some things mattered more than regulations. Over the next 2 days, Harding and 3 other mechanics worked in shifts, welding support braces onto every operational Sherman in the battalion. They used scrap steel from destroyed vehicles, German and American both. They worked without blueprints, measuring by eye and instinct. Each brace was slightly different, adapted to the specific wear pattern of each tank. It was the opposite of mass production. It was handcraft, improvisation, the kind of repair work you did when there was no factory, no supply line, no engineering team, just you and the metal and the knowledge that men would die if you got it wrong. By the time the battalion rolled out toward Mortain, 21 Shermans had been modified. The remaining tanks kept their original mounts. Moss didn't tell anyone why. He simply logged the serial numbers and waited. The battle lasted 4 days. German forces attacked with everything they had. Tigers, Panthers, 88mm guns dug into the hills. The Americans held, but at brutal cost. 14 tanks were destroyed by enemy fire. 3 more were abandoned due to mechanical failure. All 3 were unmodified Shermans. Their transmissions had seized under sustained combat load, exactly as predicted. The crews escaped, but the tanks were lost. Of the 21 modified tanks, 19 survived the battle. 2 were destroyed by direct hits, but their transmissions never failed. The crews fought until the last moment, and when they evacuated, they did so because the tank was burning, not because the machine had betrayed them. The after-action report was filed by Captain Dennis Collier, the battalion's logistics officer. He noted the mechanical failures, the survival rate of modified versus unmodified vehicles, and the crude steel braces welded beneath the transmission mounts. He wrote, Unauthorized field modification appears to have significantly improved combat reliability. Recommend immediate engineering review. The report was forwarded to Division. From Division, it went to Corps. From Corps, it was sent to the Ordnance Department in Washington, where it was read by a senior engineer named Dr. Philip Everhart, who had spent 2 years designing the M4 Sherman's transmission system. Everhart's response was 5 words long. Impossible. Transmission mounts are adequate. The report was filed and forgotten. Now I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're hearing this story. We're interested in knowing how far and at what moments of the day or night these documented accounts reach. Dr. Philip Everhart had never been to France. He had never driven a Sherman tank, never crawled beneath one in the mud, never heard the sound a transmission makes 3 seconds before it fails. He was a metallurgical engineer with a doctorate from MIT, and he had designed the Sherman's transmission mount using principles of load distribution, material science, and computational stress analysis. The mount was a masterpiece of efficient design. Minimal weight, maximum strength, optimized for the production line. It was also killing American crews, but Everhart didn't see it that way. When the report from the 5th Armored Division reached his desk in September 1944, he read it twice, then called a meeting with his team. 6 engineers gathered in a windowless office in the Ordnance Department building. They reviewed the data. 21 modified tanks, 19 survivors, 0 transmission failures. The numbers were striking, but the explanation was unacceptable. Field modifications, Everhart said, tapping the report, are not engineering solutions. They're desperate improvisations by men who don't understand the system they're tampering with. One of the junior engineers, a man named Thomas Briggs, spoke carefully. Sir, the survival rate is coincidental, Everhart interrupted. Correlation is not causation. These tanks survived because they were lucky. The modifications are cosmetic. They add weight without adding strength. If anything, they're compromising structural integrity. Briggs hesitated. Should we test them? Test what? Scrap metal welded by untrained mechanics. We designed these mounts using mathematical models. We tested them under controlled conditions. They meet specifications. If they're failing in the field, it's due to improper maintenance or operator error, not design flaws. The meeting ended. The report was stamped, no action required, and returned to Corps with a note. Field modifications are not approved for service-wide implementation. Battalion commanders are advised to enforce standard maintenance protocols. The note reached Lieutenant Colonel Moss 3 weeks later. He read it once, then burned it in a fuel drum behind the motor pool. He didn't tell his mechanics to remove the braces. He didn't tell his crews the modifications were unauthorized. He simply kept his battalion moving, and he kept count. By November, the 5th Armored had fought through Lorraine and into Alsace. They had lost 32 tanks to enemy action and 4 to mechanical failure. All 4 failures were unmodified Shermans. The modified tanks continued to run, day after day, through terrain that should have destroyed them. Other battalions began to notice. Mechanics whispered. Crews asked questions. Word spread the way it always does in war, not through official channels, but through the network of men who fix things and men who fight in them. A maintenance sergeant from the 7th Armored visited the 5th's motor pool and saw the braces. He asked Private Harding how to replicate them. Harding sketched the design on the back of a ration box. Within a week, the 7th Armored had modified 15 tanks. Within a month, 4 other battalions had done the same. The Ordnance Department never approved it. They never acknowledged it. But the modification spread across France like a virus, tank by tank, battalion by battalion, welded in the dark by men who trusted each other more than they trusted engineers in Washington. In December, Dr. Everhart received a second report. This one came from the 4th Armored Division, which had modified 63 tanks using the same crude brace design. The report included photographs, measurements, and a detailed comparison of failure rates. Modified tanks, 2% transmission failure. Unmodified tanks, 19% transmission failure. Everhart read the report in silence. Then he picked up his phone and called the commanding officer of the Army's proving ground in Aberdeen, Maryland. "I need you to test something," he said. 2 weeks later, a single modified Sherman was delivered to Aberdeen. The brace had been installed by a farm boy from Wisconsin, welded in the mud outside St. Lo, carried across France on a tank that had survived 4 major battles without a single mechanical failure. The test engineers at Aberdeen examined it with precision instruments. They measured weld penetration, brace thickness, material composition. Then they mounted the tank on a test rig and subjected it to simulated combat conditions: acceleration, deceleration, recoil shock, terrain vibration. They ran the test for 72 hours straight. The transmission never failed. The engineers wrote their report. The conclusion was 8 words long. Field modification significantly improves transmission mount durability. The report was sent to Dr. Everhart. He read it alone in his office late at night, with the sound of typewriters echoing down the hall. He had been wrong, not slightly wrong, not wrong in theory, wrong in the way that killed men. He picked up his pen and began to write a new directive. But before he finished the first sentence, he stopped, because he realized something that turned his stomach. Even if he approved the modification now, even if he ordered it installed on every Sherman in Europe, it wouldn't matter. The farm boy from Wisconsin had already saved more lives than any engineer in Washington ever would. By January 1945, the modification had spread to over 300 tanks across 7 armored divisions. It had no official name, no technical designation, no entry in any manual. Crews called it the Harding Brace, though most of them had never met Eugene Harding and never would. Mechanics called it the Stupid Fix, because it violated every principle of authorized military engineering and worked better than anything Detroit had ever designed. But in Washington, it was called something else: a problem. The issue wasn't whether the modification worked. The test results from Aberdeen had settled that. The issue was precedent. If the Army acknowledged that an unauthorized field modification designed by a 19-year-old farm boy was superior to the work of trained engineers, it would undermine the entire structure of military procurement. It would mean admitting that the men in the factories and laboratories didn't understand the war as well as the men who were fighting it. More importantly, it would mean admitting fault. A meeting was convened in February 1945 at the Pentagon. 12 men attended: engineers from the Ordnance Department, procurement officers, a legal advisor, and a brigadier general named Arthur Klein, who had commanded armor in North Africa before being reassigned to logistics. The purpose of the meeting was officially listed as Review of Field Maintenance Procedures. The actual purpose was to decide what to do about the farm boy's weld. Dr. Philip Everhart presented the test data from Aberdeen. He spoke without emotion, laying out the numbers with clinical precision. Modified tanks had an 87% reduction in transmission failures under combat load. The modification added 11 pounds of weight and cost approximately 4 hours of labor per vehicle. It required no specialized tools, no factory equipment, no supply chain. It could be installed anywhere, by anyone with basic welding skills. When he finished, the room was silent. The procurement officer spoke first. "If we officially approve this modification, we'll need to retrofit the entire M4 production line. That's 8 factories, 4,000 workers, a complete redesign of the mounting assembly. We're talking 6 months minimum before the first improved tank rolls out." Or, the legal advisor said, "We simply acknowledge that field units have found an effective interim solution and allow them to continue." "That sets a dangerous precedent," the procurement officer countered. "If we permit unauthorized modifications, we lose quality control. We lose standardization. We lose accountability." Brigadier General Klein leaned forward. "We're also losing crews." The room went quiet again. Klein continued, his voice flat and hard. "I've read the casualty reports. I've read the after-action summaries. In the last 4 months, we've lost 216 Sherman tanks to transmission failure in combat conditions. Not enemy fire, mechanical failure. Those failures resulted in 63 crew deaths and 112 injuries. Those men died because their tanks stopped moving at the worst possible moment." He paused, then looked directly at Everhart. "How many of those tanks were modified?" Everhart's jaw tightened. 7. 7 out of 216. "Yes. And how many crew deaths in those 7 modified tanks?" 4. 4 out of 63. Klein sat back. "Gentlemen, I don't care about precedent. I don't care about procurement timelines. I care about the fact that a farm boy with a welding torch has saved more American lives in the last 6 months than this entire department." The procurement officer shifted uncomfortably. "General, with respect, we can't simply—" "Yes, we can." Klein's voice was ice. "We issue a technical bulletin. We describe the modification in detail. We don't call it approved. We call it Field Expedient Reinforcement Pending Engineering Review. We distribute it to every armored unit in Europe. And we do it this week." The legal advisor cleared his throat. "That still leaves us with a problem, sir. If we acknowledge the modification works, but we don't officially approve it, and something goes wrong, then it's on me," Klein said. "I'll sign the bulletin. I'll take responsibility. Because I'd rather face a court-martial than send one more crew into combat in a tank I know is going to fail." The bulletin was issued on February 18th, 1945. It was 3 pages long, written in the dry, bureaucratic language of military directives. It described the modification as a temporary field reinforcement measure and included detailed instructions for installation. It did not mention Private Eugene Harding. It did not mention the 5th Armored Division. It did not mention the 63 men who had died waiting for someone in Washington to listen. It was distributed to every maintenance depot in Europe. By the end of March, over 800 tanks had been modified. By the end of the war, the number would exceed 2,000. But the modification would never appear in the official service manual. It would never be incorporated into the factory production line. And when the war ended, the engineers in Washington would write their final reports on the M4 Sherman, and they would describe the transmission mount as adequate for combat conditions. Eugene Harding's name would not appear in those reports either. Private Eugene Harding never saw the technical bulletin. He never knew his modification had been distributed across the European theater. He never knew that hundreds of tank crews were alive because of a weld he had made in the dark outside St. Lo, using scrap metal and a hunch. He died on March 7th, 1945, 3 weeks after the bulletin was issued. The 5th Armored Division was pushing toward the Rhine. Harding's platoon was tasked with recovering a disabled Sherman that had thrown a track during the advance. It was routine work. Drag the tank back to the motor pool, replace the track, return it to service. Harding and 2 other mechanics drove a recovery vehicle to the site, hooked cables to the disabled tank, and began the slow pull back toward friendly lines. They were halfway there when the German artillery barrage began. The first shell landed 40 yards to their left. The second landed directly on the recovery vehicle. Eugene Harding was killed instantly. He was 19 years old. He'd been in combat for 8 months. He had saved the lives of men he would never meet, in battles he would never see, using skills he had learned fixing tractors on a dairy farm in Wisconsin. His death was listed in the battalion casualty report as KIA, artillery fire during recovery operations. There was no mention of his work as a mechanic, no mention of the modification. No mention of the fact that the tank they were recovering, one of the few in the battalion that hadn't been modified, had failed because its transmission mount had fractured under combat load. Lieutenant Colonel Moss attended the burial. 23 men were interred that day in a military cemetery outside Koblenz. The chaplain spoke briefly about sacrifice and duty. Moss stood in the rain and watched the coffins lowered into the ground, and he thought about all the coffins that weren't there, all the men who had survived because a farm boy had trusted his instincts more than he trusted the engineers. After the service, Moss returned to his command tent and wrote a letter to Harding's parents. He described their son as an exemplary soldier, a skilled mechanic, and a man of quiet courage. He did not mention the modification because it was still technically unauthorized. He did not mention that their son had invented something that the Army's best engineers had failed to create. He simply wrote that Eugene had saved lives and that his loss was deeply felt. The letter was never delivered. It was lost in the chaos of the final push into Germany, one more piece of paper swallowed by the machinery of war. Eugene Harding's parents received the standard telegram. The Secretary of War desires me to express his deep regret that your son, Private Eugene J. Harding, was killed in action. They buried the telegram in a box with his high school diploma, a photograph of him in uniform, and a letter he had written home describing the French countryside. They never knew what he had built. They never knew how many men had lived because of him. After the war, the Army conducted a review of combat modifications. The Harding brace was mentioned briefly in a technical appendix described as a field expedient reinforcement developed in response to transmission mount failures observed in late 1944. No inventor was credited, no name was attached. In 1947, the M4 Sherman was phased out of service. The new tanks, M26 Pershings, M46 Pattons, had redesigned transmission mounts, incorporating lessons learned from wartime experience. The engineers who designed them never mentioned the farm boy from Wisconsin. They simply noted that improved mounting geometry and reinforced stress distribution had resolved earlier reliability issues. The braces themselves were removed during post-war refurbishment. The Shermans were either scrapped or sold to Allied nations. The welds were cut away, the scrap steel melted down, the evidence erased. By 1950, no one in the Ordnance Department remembered Eugene Harding's name. If this story surprised you, go ahead and leave a like to help the channel. For 30 years, the story slept in filing cabinets and forgotten reports. The men who had fought in the modified Shermans went home, grew old, and rarely spoke about the war. When they did, they talked about the big moments, D-Day, the Bulge, the race to Berlin. They didn't talk about transmissions. They didn't talk about the quiet terror of feeling your tank seize up under fire, or the relief of realizing it wouldn't happen because some kid you'd never met had welded a piece of scrap steel beneath the hull. But the paper remembered. In 1978, a military historian named Dr. Sarah Venn was researching M4 Sherman reliability for a doctoral thesis at the University of Michigan. She was looking for patterns in mechanical failures, trying to understand why some units suffered catastrophic breakdowns, while others maintained high operational readiness despite identical equipment and conditions. She found the answer in a dusty box at the National Archives, labeled 5th Armored Division, Maintenance Reports, 1944-45. Inside were hundreds of pages of handwritten logs, repair orders, and casualty reports. Buried among them was Captain Dennis Collier's after-action report from August 1944, the one that described the unauthorized modification and its effect on transmission reliability. Attached to it, with a rusted paperclip, was a hand-drawn sketch on the back of a ration box, Eugene Harding's original design, copied by a maintenance sergeant and filed away. Dr. Venn spent 2 months tracking down the rest of the story. She found the technical bulletin from February 1945. She found the test results from Aberdeen. She found casualty reports, maintenance logs, and letters from battalion commanders describing the modification's effectiveness. She found everything except the name of the man who had invented it. That took another year. She finally discovered Eugene Harding's name in a cross-reference between the maintenance reports and the battalion casualty list. Private E.J. Harding, mechanic, killed in action, March 1945. She found his service record, his training file, his hometown. She wrote to the Wisconsin Historical Society and received a packet of documents, birth certificate, school records, a single photograph of a thin young man in work clothes standing beside a tractor. She tried to find his family. His parents were dead. He had no siblings. The farm had been sold in 1953. The only living relative she could locate was a cousin, 71 years old, who remembered Eugene vaguely as the boy who was good with machines. Dr. Venn completed her thesis in 1979. It was titled Field Innovation and Combat Reliability, The Case of the M4 Sherman Transmission Mount Modification, 1944-1945. It was 400 pages long. Eugene Harding's story occupied 37 of them. The thesis was published by a university press with a print run of 800 copies. It was read primarily by military historians and engineering professors. It won a small academic award. It was cited in 3 subsequent papers. Then it quietly faded into the same obscurity that had claimed Eugene Harding himself. But one copy reached the desk of a retired brigadier general named Arthur Klein, who in 1979 was 78 years old and living in Alexandria, Virginia. He read it in a single sitting, and when he finished, he sat in his study for a long time, holding the photograph of Eugene Harding that Dr. Venn had included in the appendix. Klein had spent 33 years in the Army. He had received 2 Silver Stars, a Distinguished Service Medal, and a pension that allowed him to live comfortably. He had never spoken publicly about the meeting in February 1945, the one where he had forced the Ordnance Department to acknowledge what a farm boy had built in the mud. But he remembered it. He remembered the procurement officer's argument about precedent. He remembered the legal advisor's concern about accountability. He remembered the way the room had fallen silent when he asked how many men had died in modified versus unmodified tanks. He had thought at the time that he was doing the right thing, that issuing the technical bulletin, even without official approval, would save lives and honor the ingenuity of the men who had improvised solutions while the engineers argued. But now, reading Dr. Venn's thesis, he realized something else. By refusing to name Eugene Harding in the bulletin, by describing the modification as field expedient, rather than crediting its inventor, he had participated in the same institutional erasure he had fought against. Eugene Harding had saved hundreds of lives, and the Army had let him become a ghost. Klein sat down and wrote a letter to Dr. Venn. He thanked her for her research. He confirmed the details of the February 1945 meeting. And he ended with a single sentence: "I should have put his name in the bulletin." Dr. Venn received the letter 3 weeks later. She called Klein, and they spoke for 2 hours. He told her everything he remembered, the test data, the arguments, the compromise that had allowed the modification to spread without official approval. He told her that he had believed at the time that saving lives was more important than giving credit. "I was wrong," he said. "Credit matters, names matter, because without them, we forget. And if we forget, we repeat the same mistakes." Klein died in 1982. His letter to Dr. Venn was donated to the National Archives, where it was filed alongside the maintenance reports and casualty logs and forgotten sketches, one more document in the endless paper trail of war. Eugene Harding's name appeared in 3 more academic papers over the next 2 decades. Each time it was footnoted. Each time, it was a detail, a minor figure in the larger story of American armor doctrine. In 2003, the Army published a comprehensive history of M4 Sherman development. Eugene Harding was not mentioned. The transmission mount modification was described in a single paragraph as an incremental field improvement. The steel had spoken, but the institutions had not listened. In 2018, a salvage crew working in eastern France discovered the remains of an M4 Sherman, buried in a forest near the German border. The tank had been abandoned during the final push of the war, its hull stripped of useful parts, its turret removed, its engine long since seized. It had lain there for 73 years, slowly sinking into the soil, covered by leaves and moss and the indifference of time. When they pulled it from the ground, they found something unexpected. A crude, triangular brace welded beneath the transmission mount. The weld was still solid. The steel had not corroded. After 7 decades of rain and rust and neglect, the modification was intact. The salvage crew didn't know what it was. They photographed it, logged it in their inventory, and moved on. The tank was transported to a restoration facility in Belgium, where it would be refurbished for display in a military museum. A volunteer restorer named Thomas Greaves examined the brace. He had worked on dozens of Shermans over the years, and he had never seen anything like it. It wasn't part of the original design. It wasn't in any manual. But it was clearly intentional. Someone had welded it there carefully, with precision, under conditions that were anything but ideal. Greaves took photographs and posted them on a military history forum, asking if anyone recognized the modification. Within 48 hours, he received 17 responses. Most were from amateur historians and tank enthusiasts, but one was from a retired Army engineer named Michael Collier, grandson of Captain Dennis Collier, the logistics officer who had filed the original after-action report in 1944. Collier sent Greaves a scanned copy of his grandfather's report, along with a photocopy of Eugene Harding's hand-drawn sketch. The design matched perfectly. Greaves contacted Dr. Sarah Venn, who was now 76 years old and living in Ann Arbor, Michigan. She confirmed the identification and provided additional documentation, maintenance logs, casualty reports, photographs. She told Greaves the story of Eugene Harding, the farm boy who had saved a battalion and died 3 weeks before anyone in Washington acknowledged his work. Greaves decided to preserve the brace. When the Sherman was restored and placed on display at the Royal Museum of the Armed Forces in Brussels, the modification remained in place. A small plaque was added beside the tank, M4 Sherman Medium Tank, 5th Armored Division, 1944-1945. This vehicle features a field-modified transmission mount reinforcement designed and installed by Private Eugene J. Harding, U.S. Army, in August 1944. The modification significantly improved combat reliability and was later adopted by multiple armored units across the European theater. P.V.2 Harding was killed in action on March 7, 1945, near Koblenz, Germany. He was 19 years old. The plaque is small. Most visitors walk past it without reading. But for those who stop, who crouch beneath the tank and examine the weld, it tells a different story than the one written in official histories. It tells the story of what happens when institutions value procedure over people, when engineers in laboratories refuse to listen to mechanics in the mud, when the men who build the war are forgotten by the men who write about it. It tells the story of Eugene Harding, who trusted his instincts, who understood steel better than the experts, who saved lives without ever knowing it, and who died anonymous in a war that could not afford to admit he had been right. And it tells a harder truth, that the innovation came not from the factory or the laboratory, but from the field, that the solution came not from the men with degrees, but from the man with a wrench, that the army was saved by the very improvisation it tried to suppress. In 2021, the U.S. Army published a new field manual on combat vehicle maintenance. In the section on transmission systems, there is a single paragraph about field modifications. It reads, "Personnel are encouraged to report mechanical issues through proper channels. Unauthorized modifications may compromise vehicle safety and are subject to review. Eugene Harding is not mentioned." The manual does not acknowledge that the greatest improvement to the M4 Sherman's reliability came from a farm boy with a welding torch working in the dark without approval, because he understood something the engineers did not, that steel under combat load does not behave the way steel in a laboratory behaves. That theory fails when the ground is shaking and the shells are falling and the machine is screaming for help. The war ended 78 years ago. The men who fought in the modified Shermans are nearly all gone. The engineers who dismissed the modification are dead. The procurement officers who delayed its approval are forgotten. But the steel remains. In Belgium, in museums, in private collections, in photographs and archives and dusty boxes at the National Archives, the braces still exist. Some have been cut away. Some have been restored. Some are rusted, cracked, barely recognizable. But they are there, silent witnesses to the war between the wrench and the blueprint. And if you know where to look, if you crouch beneath the hull and trace the weld with your fingers, you can still feel the shape of Eugene Harding's hand, the way he held the torch, the angle he chose, the instinct that told him where the stress would concentrate and how to redirect it. You can feel the urgency, the darkness, the knowledge that men would die if he got it wrong. And you can feel something else, the proof that the most important innovations in war are not made in factories or laboratories, but in the field, by the people who understand that steel is not just metal, it is the skin between a crew and death. And if you know how to listen, it will tell you where it needs to be saved. Subscribe to our channel to explore more documented and unsettling archived cases. Thank you for following the story of Eugene Harding. See you in the next video. The war ended, but the steel still carries the sound of what should never have been forged, and the silence of the man who saved it.